Welcome to Bards Atlas. Enjoy.
Incoming message. New database submission imminent. Bar designation.
Fox.
Log ID.
0012-13. Subject. The Weathervane.
Compiled. Begin submission.
Long ago, in the beautiful hills and valleys of the east, was a large estate with lots and lots of land. It sat far from town, and was quite the journey to reach from whatever direction anyone deigned to come from. And so very few people ever did make the journey, and those that did were loath to leave the confines of the estate. With its simple elegance and regal antiquity, it was much harder to come by than the scores of hills and valleys that surrounded it. Thus was the curse of the Weathervane. The poor schmuck that got stuck tied to a pole out in the middle of a clearing in the forest, distant from any people he could interact with, despondent to civilization, and devoid of all ambition. Yet he was content to float there several meters off the ground, content to shuffle to the left and right frequently throughout the day so that large patch of grass he shadowed could have some access to sunlight. He was content to watch and wait and listen. For what, he couldn't be sure of, but he figured he'd know it when he saw, heard, or smelled it. Was he listening for this buzzing bug that was trying to make a hive in his large, soft ears? No, but he listened to it anyways, because what choice did he have? It was in his ears, and his arms were too short to reach. Was he looking for the gliding leaves that were gently brushed from the tops of the forest trees by the cool, soft breeze? No. But they were hard to miss. Leaves had entered the clearing and hit him in the face before, with the oddest, unexpected crunch. He wondered what it would be like to pile all the leaves up and jump in them. Was he waiting for the small girl to come skipping out of the forest in a bright yellow dress singing loudly before seeing a giant floating weathervane tied to a pole? Oh, wait. This had never happened before. The bugs, sure. The leaves a few thousand times. The blades of grass he had all but named, but as long as he had been tied up out here, and he really wasn't sure how long that was, no little girl had ever come out of the forest, let alone a person who seemed so bright and warm. She stopped in the middle of the clearing and stared up at him, dropping her basket of fruit she was collecting. This makes sense, the Weathervane said aloud. His booming voice echoed throughout the trees around the clearing, as he had not spoken in a long time and wasn't sure what a proper speaking volume was. The fruit that falls year-round has to go somewhere, after all. Of course, a little girl comes and collects it all. The little girl stared up at him, and the Weathervane stared right back down at her, curious. He had never seen a person before, but he knew they existed, for some reason. She had certainly never seen a Weathervane before, at least not one who could see her right back. "You're loud," the girl said. "Do you always talk like that?" The Weathervane would have blushed if he could. Doing his best to soften his voice, he said, "Why, no, I don't usually talk at all." "Why not?" the girl asked. The Weathervane stared around the clearing. "Well, as you can see, there's no one to listen to a Weathervane like myself," he explained. "And I'm not sure exactly what else I'm supposed to do all day." The girl giggled. "But didn't you just say you're a Weathervane? That means you watch the weather, right?" The Weathervane had never thought of that before. "I've never thought of that before," he said, his loud, low voice trailing off. "So, how's the weather today?" the girl asked. The Weathervane smiled, taking a look around, satisfied with his new purpose. "Quite sunny, I think." The girl had so many questions for the Weathervane. Why was he tied up? Who put him here? How did he float in the sky? Why were his arms so little? He had few answers to these, but even more questions for her. What were people like? What was the town like? What had she come out here for? What does it feel like to walk on two legs, or to have such little ears, or to jump in a pile of leaves? They talked and talked and talked, but eventually the sun was setting, and the little girl had to go home. But on that day, she made a promise that she would come back every week to ask about the weather. And come back she did. A week later, and the week after that, and the one after that. And every day she would ask him how the weather was, and then ask him more questions about things happening in the forest, or the stars, or his own mind. He cherished her visits. No one, after all, had ever thought him important enough to speak to, or cared what he thought. Up until now, he wasn't even sure that he was conscious, but week after week she would come back to visit for hours on end, laughing and playing and giving as many answers as she could to the lives of people, and more, her own life, specifically. She talked about her 50 dream jobs, and her 50 dream homes, and her 50 dream boys, and her 50 first choices for names of her future 50 children. She wanted to see the world and then to see other worlds. She talked of taking long vacations from her job as a space pirate with a degree in law and medicine to come visit for months. And always, she asked him how the weather was today. The weeks turned into months, and the months into years. Every week was the same. She would journey out, sometimes from home, sometimes from town, but always alone. No one was supposed to come out here, she said, but she thought he was worth getting in trouble to talk to. As she got older and older, her conversations more frequently evaded dreams of the future and more often settled for problems of the present. Her teachers at school were all evil and wanted her to fail. Her tests were too hard. Her workload too heavy. Life in her town must be really hard, the Weathervane thought to himself on one particularly shadowy day. As time wore on, even those were not big enough problems to talk about. Soon, her friends were talking behind her back. Her boyfriend was cheating with her best friend. Her parents didn't understand her. People in her town must be really shallow and mean, the Weathervane thought on one especially rainy day. As her life got more and more complex, even the Weathervane was not always a good enough ear to listen to her problems. Her visits became less frequent. She skipped weeks every now and then without apology or explanation. So much is going on in her life. Surely she needs me now more than ever, the Weathervane thought as a storm flew overhead, drenching him in a torrential downpour. But as time wore on, her visits not only became less frequent, they became less meaningful. She would always ask how the weather was, sure, and he would ask about her disheveled hair, her sleepless eyes, maybe even the funny marks on her arms, but every time she came out, he tried harder and harder. She gave him less and less, until eventually he gave up trying too. One day she came out, 15 years from the day they had met. He had counted, because he had had little else to do all these years but count the seconds between her visits, and it took a lot longer to do that these days, but he had time. This time it had been 3 weeks since her last visit, and he had become very sad. As she waded out to him in the middle of a monsoon, he felt just a flicker of joy before becoming quite sad again. No longer did she care about him or think him important. All she cared about now was that boyfriend that had dumped her twice already, Craig, or whatever his name was. He stayed silent as she approached, not wanting to give her ammunition for another dump of her own anguish. She waded through the water, splashing it as it was almost to her knees now. He almost felt bad for her, having chosen, it seemed, a hard day to come see him. But no, he thought, she had made her choice long before coming here about how she felt about their friendship. She looked up at him. Once she was so close she could reach out and touch him, were she tall enough. Her eyes were soft and sad. Her hair was plastered to her face by the water, but her hood flapped in the wind as she looked into his eyes. "How's the weather today?" she asked. The Weathervane looked down at her for a long time, saying nothing. She hung her head. "My family is leaving the estate. Storms have gotten too bad for us to make a life here." She looked back into his eyes, a single tear distinguishable from all the rain around her. "This is goodbye," she said, and she reached up her hand out towards him. He stared at it as lightning flashed across the sky. "You should go, then," he said in his sad, booming voice. He turned away from her and stared out at the dark clouds. He did not hear her splashing as she left. Maybe it was drowned out by the sound of the storm in his large ears, but at some point he realized that she was gone. After a moment that could have been hours, he realized how foolish he had been. She had come here to apologize, not to further hurt him. He turned around, searching frantically along the flooded clearing for her, but could find no trace or sign that she was ever even here. As he looked at the wind-blown trees barren from the months of cold fronts, he could barely even recall her coming through the trees on that first warm day. He realized today that he did not know how to cry. He was physically incapable. He darted back and forth, his tiny fists clenched, his eyes shut, trying to muster the tears he felt in his soul, but he could not, for he was just a Weathervane. If only he could see her again, speak to her once more, see her shining blue eyes beaming up at him from below. He would apologize. He would be sorry for ever taking her for granted and becoming so selfish. Now all he wanted was for a terrible wind to come blow him away, far into the stratosphere. Maybe he could find a way to forget, then. Maybe he could start a new life. Perhaps he would perish, but at this moment he wasn't even sure if he was alive to begin with. It went on like that for days. The storms got worse, the fields were flooded, and the forest washed away. Not even a buzzing bug to make a hive in his large, soft ears now. No grass to take care of. No weather to watch, as always. It was always the same now. And, like before, time ceased to exist for him. He was not sure quite when he noticed it. How long had he been staring at where there used to be a small, well-laid path in the trees? How long had he gazed at that spot, hoping? And here, on this day, was a new visitor, a hooded figure rowing in on a canoe of sorts. The wind faltered for a moment. The waters that had risen quelled for a time. The thunder was mollified. His eyes were on the strange new visitor, mostly in shock. Who are you?" he boomed too loudly, for he had not spoken to anyone for quite some time and was not sure what a proper speaking volume should be. The stranger rowed up to the post at which he was tethered and tied her canoe to it. She then slid back her hood to reveal familiar, bright blue eyes. But she was not the same. She was younger, somehow, and she smelled like sugar and rubber. She looked up at the Weathervane with curiosity and wonder, but not surprise. "My mother wants to know how the weather is today," she said with a small smile. A glint of sunshine passed across his face as he beamed right back. "Quite sunny, I think."
End of submission. Submission status: fact, fiction, uncertain.
This is a fictional tale that was written by Dr. Barlow Sr. He included it as an annotation in the Journal of Emperor Fong on the planet Luvitus. Sham, Adrian, if you get this, you should know. Your father loved you very much.
Compiled. Database updated. Awaiting further submissions. Standby mode initiated.
We hope you enjoyed tonight's episode of Bards Atlas. This episode was written by Preston Richard. Music and editing by Preston Richard. Bards Atlas is a narrative and lore-building podcast that follows Fox and Eli, two traveling bards seeking new knowledge and stories across the universe. If you'd like to get in touch with us or submit an image or work of art to inspire a future episode, send an email to bardsatlas@gmail.com or find us on Facebook and Twitter. Don't forget to leave a comment and a rating, and please share the program with friends and family. And as always, thank you so much for listening.